Good morning, although, albeit barely still morning at this point in time. I would ask how you are, but I'm unlikely to get a response now, am I? There's a certain level of liberation in allowing yourself to talk to the void, as opposed to a specific entity. The void doesn't judge you so much as you judge yourself in that situation. It's interesting where, at this point, I don't even practically understand why I do what I do. Not because of any real difference in happenings, but because habits are a thing that you can form, which can be either good or bad, or some people could even try and say anything habitual is inherently bad because it's a failure to adapt. And I can acknowledge that. I disagree, but only on premise, because certain things that are habits exist for very good reasons. Such things as washing your hands, other forms of hygiene. Most of them are overblown by today's standard, agreeably. However, there's a certain if there's more or less two types of people in this world, unfortunately. There is those who are willing to adapt and those who are not, and those who are unwilling to adapt tend to be much more habitual. So it would make sense that habits are something that people would look down upon in a situation where humankind, by and large, does its best when it is able to adapt. It would be something to be frowned upon if you were unable to. We live in a world where people try and rule in black and white, whereas it's typically much more reasonable to view the world in shades of gray. But there's a question as to how much reason and logic a person should endow themselves with, how much emotion, and how much decision can a person make before emotion ends up taking its own cut of the situation. There's nothing really saying that anyone should behave a specific way aside from the laws of your specific circumstance. There's no inherent right, inherent truth, aside from that we are. What are we? That's for you to decide, really. But we are. We do exist. Be that as it may, what that means is largely up to the person in question, rather than the world or some larger knowing. And more often than not, it's a thing that people take comfort in the fact that, by and large, what you do will be largely unnoteworthy. The nihilistic approach. It's reasonable because if you're going to try and view the world, everything that you ever do, every life that you ever touch, it will all eventually be nothing. Eventually. And yet people still rally against this notion. They attempt to seek what they would find for their version of immortality, whether it be through progeny, some invention, some way they can get their name written down on a piece of paper, or in the modern age, put into a hierarchy, a database, a matrix, listed chronologically through time, people, dates, accomplishments, bullet pointed, things that people in the modern age might not consider the same as through their times. And also, by and large, a person's worth is usually not determined until after they're finished, until after they can produce no more. And then you get what people would hail as artificial value. You end up waking up in the morning, and I've taken to making a dream journal, and I ask myself, what do the dreams mean? And they can mean nothing, or they can mean everything. And for some odd reason, most people don't realize that there's a spot in between where it could mean a little bit of something and a little bit of nothing. A little bit of a gray dream, which is weird. When I dreamed, I used to dream specifically in the color gray, and that was the way that I was able to determine what was dream and what was real. My mind would put on a shader for it. In recent dreams, as I remember them more and more, the way that I am able to recall whether it is a dream or reality is whether or not what laws exist and what rules governing the world exist in this world apply to the dream world. Namely, I take off my glasses, as I am a person who wears glasses during the day to be able to see. There was a time in my life when I had attempted to wear contacts, and it more or less made me have difficulty to having grips on reality, because I couldn't tell what was real and what was a dream. Because oftentimes I view the world not as other people view the world, and I guess that could be said for just about anybody. But through my life, I tend to always get what I want, and that, I believe, is somewhat fair to be said for any human being. It's just a question of how high you set your sights and whether or not you'll be willing to make sacrifices, and what you hold as valuable to you as an individual. What does it mean to have what you want if all you've ever had your entire life is what you want? You would then strive for artificial difficulty to make yourself able to feel that there is some sense of accomplishment along the way. I would be probably seen as largely ungrateful for the things, the gifts that I've been given throughout my life. I don't disagree. I have been exceptionally lucky. I acknowledge that I'm exceptionally lucky, and I have had almost nothing but good fortune. But I, as an individual, do my best work when I am surrounded by chaos. Or at least that's how I feel. And I believe that there is a certain argument of human nature, Dostoevsky style, where a human, simply to spite what they would perceive as nature, would be more willing to throw away a comfortable living because they don't want to be seen as an instrument to be played, rather as their own individual with their own sovereignty, their own state of mind, their own consciousness. But what makes a person a person? Is it the agency one carries over their own life? Is it your accomplishments? Is it simply the life that you lead? And then you would go the largest numbers that we have right now. The easiest way that people would be able to seek their quote-unquote immortality is to then follow what nature or our biology would tell us to do, which is to procreate, to create progeny. Progeny ending up being something that, well, if you look through history, most people carry a common ancestor in Attila the Hun, I believe was his name, who has thousands of offspring, and now billions probably at this point in time, because he seeked to be immortal, as do we all to some extent. And yet, if we were to find a person who were able to physically be immortal, not only would we do everything in our power to try and alter that, because humans are a very greedy bunch. They don't think that other people should have something that others cannot have. There was a study where it was concluded that people were much more likely to they would rather have nothing if it meant other people could have nothing, rather than both people have something. They would think it is much more worthwhile to deny both people of said item than for other people to be gifted things, because they would perceive what the other person has as superior to what they have, even if they are identical objects. This is simply how human brains work, unfortunately. I think that there should possibly be some form of conditioning to be able to reduce this effect. However, I believe, what was it, trait openness versus trait agreeableness. The more agreeable person would be would be willing to give away their item to the other person if they perceived that it was better than their own, and in so doing would then confuse the individual even further, because then they wouldn't know why they still perceive their original item that they originally held as better after they gave it to somebody else, because then they would have some nostalgia for it. It's ridiculous. Human beings are such a complex, interesting species, and yet ultimately very simple at the end of the day. It's so bizarre. This is why it's my preferred method of study. We're never going to run out of human beings, at least not in my lifetime, and we're never going to run out of people who have questions that we cannot answer. Therefore, psychology is going to be the thing that I deem the most appropriate to study, with a slight background of philosophy. Because philosophy ends up being a thing that everyone can converse about, whether you be the lowest level intellectual from the slums or the highest tier of intelligence on the planet. Philosophy will be conversation that people can have, because it is rooted not in intelligence, but in the basis that your morality, your reality are based upon, which is a fascinating concept if you think about it. Everyone in the entire world, whether they share language or not, whether they have access to the same senses, facilities, functionality as one another, the thing that we all would be able to unify under is that we can all have somewhat intelligent conversation about philosophical ideology. It's bizarre. A person can agree or disagree on religion and yet still have an agreement upon base level philosophies at times. And it doesn't matter where you come from, because we're all human. This is one of the bases that I would like to ultimately turn into a thesis, that there is at least one yet either undiscovered or untapped version of communication that humankind all shares. Humankind is such a a specific species. Understandably so, in that you would have difficulty trying to unify people of different languages and creeds and whatnot. But there are species of finch, for example, who, raised worlds apart from one another, speaking literally different languages, are able to still understand one another. If we, as what we could hail as theoretically the most intelligent species on the planet, cannot do this, there is something fundamentally wrong in our understanding, and or we do not know as much as we should know about ourselves, which could definitely be seen as true. We don't know as much as we could know about our own planet, yet we still seek to spread our wings and go to other planets, which, understandable. Perhaps we could find out more about them, and therefore more about ourselves. Or perhaps on them we could find things that change our understanding of everything we know. It's entirely reasonable. It's entirely possible. Unlikely, as it may be. But what is the likelihood of anything? Statistically speaking, the likelihood of humanity existing is either largely considered to be next to 0% or 100%, depending on where you come from. It's 100% because we currently exist, therefore we have to exist, therefore 100%. However, statistically speaking, look at where we are in the universe. And look at any other forms of life. Do you see any? No? Well, this is either chance or luck or something in between. And yet, everything that has ever happened in our species case of events, in our species timeline, is but a bug spot. Our planet is so young compared to the universe, and it will eventually die. And that's why we should seek other planets. However, should we really burden the remainder of the universe with this creature, this species, that tends to... We're very odd. Not only are we uniquely damaging to one another, where we would rather damage some people more than we would rather survive, but we are also the only animal species that shares food. We're the only animals who would willingly give up food to people that are not of their lineage, not of their family, not of the familiar circle, their pack, whatever, what have you. The only animals who would be willing to give what we would class as strangers things to eat. It's very... goes against the nature of what nature typically was seen as intending. Of course, we're also the only species that can intelligently throw objects. So one could then logically deduce that there might be some connection. I also doubt it, but it's possible. Then again, we're also related to fungi. Like, biologically speaking, the closest genetic ancestors to us right now are funguses and pigs. And then, after that, the great apes. Which would then lead credence to the aquatic ape theory. My, I'm going on such a bizarre tirade today. It does feel good to just kind of ramble, though. I don't even know where I was going. Anyway. Philosophy. Philosophical doctrine may be one of the keys to understanding humanity better. And hopefully in so doing, finding a way for us to unify while still staying separate so that we do not end up destroying ourselves.